All right. Well, tonight we begin the first half of A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. I don't know if your edition had a preface, not A Grief Observed.
Yeah,
Surprised by Joy.
Oh, I read the wrong book. Oh, I got.
Yeah, I was freaking out there for a sec.
Everybody panic.
We missed a couple.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it is. Surprised by Joy. And as I said, this is his account on how he moved from atheism to Christianity. And yeah, so he is not trying to write a complete autobiography. So we should understand that. Here's Natasha. I did. Okay. So, chapter 1 is entitled The First Years. So, you will notice that Lewis is not English, he's Irish. It's actually where Alistair McGrath starts off his biography on Lewis, is to point out that many people thought he was English, but he was in fact Irish. So any particular thoughts on chapter 1? For those who read it?
How far were we supposed to be?
To chapter 7.
Okay, we did 8. We're ahead of the game.
I know.
We weren't sure. I didn't sure if the preface counted, and it's like we did one.
Everything counts.
I know you're gonna get the.
Oh,
probably.
he's a lawyer. Remember
Oh,
you said, what's he
I
do
didn't
for a
know what
living?
his dad did, so he was a lawyer. Okay, good, we got it. Then. That was my
Oh,
question.
that's all. There we go.
Very smart lawyer.
Oh,
So I might be referring to something in other chapters because it's kind of hard when you have a hard copy to flip back and forth in the book. But
okay.
a lot of things he tells us about his life, he's told us in other ways at other times, like
Right.
when his mother dies and the relationship with his father.
Yeah.
The growing closer with his brother, I don't think we knew that much about that part of his life.
Right.
So that
Yeah.
was kind of new.
Yes, for sure.
And I could relate.
Yes. So, just starting out, he introduces his family, particularly when we'll notice we don't tend to think in these terms, right? He goes back a couple of generations. He notices family traits. So he says the Hamiltons were like this, and the Lewises were like this. My dad was like this. My mom was like this. And we tend to, in our thinking, tend to think more of ourselves as self-generating. So we don't tend to think the generations ahead have really shaped us, right? And even sometimes our own parents, we don't recognize the degree to which who they were shapes and forms who we are. So I certainly appreciate this starting off to say, I see myself in these generations. I see some of these family traits in myself or in my brother. I just think that's good. And I think, as we think about ourselves as holistic people, that it is important to go back. A number of years ago, when I was finishing my undergrad degree, I had to do a history of Christianity course, and the final assignment was to do my own church history. And so I interviewed my mom, I interviewed my omama about kind of their church history, and that was just eye-opening for me, and gave me such a stronger sense of roots of faith than I had up to that point told my own story. You know, I thought it all started for me in a low Baptist church when I was somewhere between 4 to 6 years old. The reality is, no, it started a lot further back than that. One of the things that I saw that I thought was important, from my earliest years, I was aware of the vivid contrast between my mother's cheerful and tranquil affection and the ups and downs of my father's emotional life. And this bred in me long before I was old enough to give it a name, a certain distrust or dislike of emotion as something uncomfortable and embarrassing and even dangerous. So when I read that, I heard echoes from a grief observed when he talked about how his stepsons, Joy's sons, would feel about his emotionalism, his grief at her death, that they would just be embarrassed by it. So that may have just been in his head. That may not have been, in fact.
Yeah, he assumed that would be the way they would react because that's how he would have reacted.
Yeah. And did, right? Because
Yeah.
we've got a few parallels between him and his brother as children having lost their mother and how their father reacted to his own reaction, which sounds a whole lot more emotional than he would give himself credit for. So again, you know, even as we think about ourselves, I think it's just a good reminder that we don't necessarily have the truth even about ourselves. Reality is, people around us may actually know me better than I know myself. Both of his parents are bookish, clever people. And it sounds like his mother was a tremendous woman, the way that he describes her. And it sounds like he really resonated. There was quite the kinship between her and he, whereas his older brother seemed to be more in line with their father. They had a nurse. And interestingly enough, we see, actually, we didn't see it because we didn't read it, but if we had read Magician's Nephew, I wonder if the character of the housemaid reminds of his nurse. We saw in Prince Caspian, there was his nurse told the stories and she was a good woman and she's kind of saved at the end of that story as well. So there's certainly roots of Lewis as a child that maybe we didn't realize how much of his own childhood he had brought in.
When he went on about his animal land and
Yes.
fantasies, so when you go, oh, that's where Narnia come from.
Right,
all
right,
the
right.
animals.
Yeah,
That was all in his head from a little one.
yes. It's always interesting to hear the differences between he and his brother. And I mean, Animal Land in India
Yeah.
is a great kind of symbol of the difference between the two.
So were you familiar with all these authors that he kept referencing to? And
Some of them, not all of them, no.
because I mean, those would have shaped all his thinking and the way he would put things together, his thought process.
I don't know that they would have necessarily shaped, because he's still quite young, these books, but they're an entrance into a world, the habit of reading, and I think it sparks some, like the death of Arthur there. I mean, Renaissance was kind of his area, and Arthurian literature, for sure. So I think they're beginning, and you know, but it's the habit of the home to read, and he found a passion for it. He was skilled at it. And in some ways, he describes in the later chapters that it became problematic, right? Adults thought that he was being high and mighty. The reality is he didn't feel any pride in it at all. He just was reading. No pictures on the walls of my father's house ever attracted our attention. So I wondered if we have something of Aunt Alberta's home with Voyage of the Dawn Treader when I read that. Then we have this moment, and it really introduces the theme of this book. And for Lewis, I think the life pursuit of his Christian writing. He says, once in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin, which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever knew. And beauty is a theological category, by the way. What the real garden had failed to do, the toy garden did. It made me aware of nature, not indeed as a storehouse of forms and colors, but as something cool, dewy, fresh, exuberant. I do not think the impression was very important at the moment, but it soon became important in memory. As long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden. And every day there were what we call the green hills. That is the lone line of the, okay, so that's important. That moment of captivation, that moment of insight of beauty, that captures him there.
Nature.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes and no.
And I thought it was interesting that the more sort of pragmatic, practical, trains and ships, and brother is the one that actually brought the garden into even thought of doing it.
Right. Which, if you've ever seen the people that set up the train tables and that, they bring all sorts of trees in. That is part of the making it. But yeah, I know what you mean.
When I read this about this moss in this garden, I pictured something dirty, and it was like, maybe that's the first time he's seen something dirty, get your hands dirty, and he gravitated to that. Maybe everything was so sterile around there that this was a warp scene to take him out of that.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like, you don't want your kids to get dirty. Well, sometimes it's really good. Go get dirty. Go play in the mud. It's the second glimpse came through Squirrel Nutkin.
Yeah.
Is that a cartoon or?
No, that's a Beatrix Potter book.
Oh yeah, Beatrix Potter books.
Yeah.
What's that?
Peter Rabbit.
Okay.
So she wrote Peter Rabbit and Squirrel Nutkin and others. So the fear of bugs, again, I think we see Eustace and family in there. Eustace was always wanting to pin things down and only like books of information. So Lewis was not that type. And in fact, that kind of book was frightening. It was a nightmare for him. So they moved to a bigger house. That was a change. And then there's this world of endless books. No idea where they came from because the old house apparently didn't have them and they suddenly appeared in the new
They're
house.
Probably in boxes.
Yeah, I guess. But we see the type of person Lewis is, right? He likes the attic. He likes the books. He likes that quiet of the home. So again, I think we hear Professor Kirk's big house that the children were able to play in, and Professor Kirk is kind of always in his study, in a remote part that must never be disturbed. Then his brother is off to boarding school, so it's just him. And we have that, remember, Lewis often uses the language of the term is over, the holidays have begun, will never end, to be kind of that sense of joy of heaven. We find out in this book where that comes from. But already it's here, right? His brother goes away. This is his companion. And so it's holidays when his brother returns that is the joy, there's rapture. And then when he has to go back to school, that's difficult. That's hard for him. And we continue to see that math was not his strong suit. And we learned something physical. So the Lewis men, where you and I have two joints on the thumb, only one of them worked.
The top one,
The
right?
top one, yeah.
So they
So
couldn't
this
do
lower one didn't bend.
That'd be weird, wouldn't it?
Well, and
Yeah.
it changed things, right? So he talks about writing as a result of not being able to do things. You know, you try and cut something straight, but because of that thumb, as soon as he tried to cut it straight, it go crooked. And when he tried to go crooked, it would go straight. So he became a writer.
Yeah, that's right.
And it changed his life.
And he couldn't pull a trigger. Doesn't it say something about that too?
I don't remember that,
Handling a
but that
gun or
certainly
something
may
about
have
gun
been.
or Maybe I'm wrong. Reading too many books. They're all.
Oh, that's okay.
He did go to war.
Did he?
Yes.
He gets loose there?
Yeah, he was a soldier in World War I. And he talks about that. He makes reference to it at one point.
Somebody.
Yeah, and in the last chapter, chapter 7, he talks about the number of the boys that actually died in the
Yes,
Second World War.
that's right. Yeah. That is where you're right. That's where he references it. So he's forgiven these things as they've passed on him. So he recognizes himself as the creator of a world. So he doesn't believe in it, because that would be foolish. So in my daydreams, I was training myself to be a fool. In mapping and chronicling Animal Land, I was training myself to be a novelist. No, well, a novelist, not a poet. My invented world was full for me of interest, bustle, humor, and character. But there was no poetry, even no romance in it. It was almost astonishingly prosaic. Thus, if we use the word imagination in the third sense, the highest sense of all, this invented world was not imaginative. Okay, so Okay, so here's the part that I was trying to get to before as important that we need to pick up. And he seems to have started in a paragraph before. So as I stood beside a flowering currant bush on a summer day, there suddenly arose in me without warning, and as if from a depth, not of years, but of centuries, the memory of that earlier morning at the old house when my brother had brought his toy garden into the nursery. It is difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. Milton's A Normal Bliss of Eden comes somewhere near it. It was a sensation, of course, of desire. But desire for what? Not certainly for a biscuit tin filled with moss, nor even for my own past. Before I knew what I desired, the desire itself was gone, the whole glimpse withdrawn. The world turned commonplace again, or only stirred by a longing for the longing that had just ceased. It had taken only a moment of time, and in a certain sense, everything else that had ever happened to me was insignificant in comparison. So this longing. So he goes on, as Bob said, the second glimpse is Squirrel Nutkin. One went back to the book, not to gratify the desire, but to reawake it. In this experience also, there was the same surprise and the same sense of incalculable importance. It was something quite different from ordinary life and even from ordinary pleasure, something, as they would now say, in another dimension. And he talks about a third glimpse. Instantly, I was uplifted into huge regions of northern sky. I desired with almost sickening intensity something never to be described. And then, as in the other examples, found myself at the very same moment already falling out of that desire and wishing I were back in it. The reader who finds these three episodes of no interest need read this book no further. For, in a sense, the central story of my life is about nothing else. For those who are still disposed to proceed, I will only underline the quality common to the three experiences. It is that of an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. I call it joy, which is here a technical term and must be sharply distinguished from happiness and from pleasure. Joy has indeed one characteristic, and only one, in common with them: the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. Apart from that, and considered only in its quality, it might almost equally well be called a particular kind of unhappiness or grief. But when it is a kind we want, I doubt whether anyone who has tasted it would ever, if both were in his power, exchange it for all the pleasures in the world. But then joy is never in our power, and pleasure often is. Carol, I thought of you as I've read this chapter too, because he talks about the loss of his mother, and he says, children suffer not less than their elders, but differently. For us boys, the real bereavement had happened before our mother died. We lost her gradually as she gradually withdrawn from our life into the hands of nurses and delirium and morphia. And as our whole existence changed into something alien and menacing, as the house became full of strange smells and midnight noises and sinister whisper conversations. This had two further results, one very evil and one very good. It divided us from our father as well as our mother. They say that a shared sorrow draws people closer together. I can hardly believe that it often has that effect when those who share it are of widely different ages. So I thought of you because so often as we've discussed Lewis's work, I think you've kind of noted his adultness, his put togetherness, but in this book,
Mhm.
seems to be able to step back into that childhood and I think give us a bit more of a glimpse and maybe create some more sympathetic author for us.
Absolutely. And he doesn't really sound like he understands what's happening
Mhm.
to him as a kid,
Yeah,
but he just identifies it as being different than what adults experience. And
Yeah.
that's the same feeling I got in Narnia when he was talking to the four kids.
yeah,
This sort of, he understood that they would be different.
yeah.
I think too that it makes me think of the scene where Lucy and Susan follow Aslan when he's
Yeah.
going to the stone table.
Yeah. Right.
And just because they're children, he does not discount their grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think there's in here somewhere, I can't remember, that, you know, a child should not feel such grief. That's not true.
Mm.
They do.
Yes.
I also thought of you, Carol, when you were talking about Ron and, you know, how he was withdrawing within himself, and he left you long before he died. So it's kind of a similar process that you went
Yeah,
through as well.
in counseling terms, it's called anticipatory grief.
Mm-hmm.
So that when you know that you're headed to grief, there is going to be nothing. And while in some ways we live a life of anticipatory grief,
Yeah.
but then you do have set moments at which a diagnosis from a doctor or a lump or just changes everything forever. And then that's when you're starting to move that way. And because Ron was 8 years in the process of dying. And so I moved in and out of. So for a while I'd be very focused on it, and then go through a spell and I think, well, this isn't going to happen. It's sort of okay, you know, and I just went back and forth. But when he died, having done that anticipatory grief did not, and I don't think for me, made any difference to how I experienced the grief. I mean, he was unconscious and he'd been unconscious for days and he had pneumonia, and I was still totally bamboozled by his death. Just knocked flat. Now, maybe if I hadn't gone through those years of anticipatory grief, it would be more so, but I can't imagine it actually. I can't imagine what it would have been like. But anticipatory grief is a preparation thing. Kids don't go through anticipatory grief. That's the difference in childhood. They have changes in their life, but they don't connect them with the death. And I think you could hear that when Lewis was describing noises and whispers and funny sounds in the house. And so he's separated from his mother more than, without really realizing that it's his death or her death that he's heading towards.
Right.
How old was Lewis when his mom died?
I'm not sure. You can calculate it because he gives some markers, but he never says I was this much old. But I think he
About
was.
six or so, I think.
6 or 7, I think.
6 or 7, yeah, somewhere in there.
I think so. I was tempted to do the math, but I wanted to just read through it.
Because it's like, you know, you see little kid and you're seeing your father acting like he had said here wildly and unjustly and all these things,
Mhm.
would have been foreign to him. Probably
Right.
would never have seen that. So how do you react to something you've never seen?
Well, that and with that gravitation, right? Again, it sounds like maybe his mother was a bit of a buffer.
Yeah.
And suddenly
Mhm.
he's stripped of protection, right? From this guy who's so up and down and not steady.
Bipolar, maybe. What's going on?
Mhm.
Well, it's
You're
grieving, right?
Yeah.
And he's having outbursts.
Well, right at the end of that chapter, he talks about the continent Atlantis had sank,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
there was, but no more of the old security. It was
Mm.
sea and islands now. The great
Yeah.
continent had sunk like Atlantis.
yeah. And he talks about losing both parents in this moment. Like
Mhm.
he and his brother become separated from their father, and there's this gulf that seemingly doesn't get overcome. We should also note here,
Mhm.
he learns something about prayer, or he takes on something about prayer that's maybe not so helpful. When her case was pronounced hopeless, I remembered what I had been taught, that prayers offered in faith would be granted.
Yeah.
Mm.
I accordingly set myself to produce by willpower a firm belief that my prayers for her recovery would be successful. And as I thought, I achieved it. When, nevertheless, she died, I shifted my ground and worked myself into a belief that there was to be a miracle. The interesting thing is that my disappointment produced no results beyond itself. The thing hadn't worked, but I was used to things not working, and I thought no more about it. I think the truth is that the belief into which I had hypnotized myself was itself too irreligious for its failure to cause any religious revolution. I had approached God, or my idea of God, without love, without awe, even without fear. He was, in my mental picture of this miracle, to appear neither as savior nor as judge, but merely as a magician. And when he had done what was required of him, I supposed he would simply, well, go away. It never crossed my mind that the tremendous contact which I solicited have any consequences beyond restoring the status quo. I imagine that a faith of this kind is often generated in children, and that its disappointment is of no religious importance, just as the things believed in, if they could happen and be only as the child pictures them, would be of no religious importance either. I thought that was interesting.
It's very true
Yes, it
of the
is.
way kids go through
Mhm.
process.
Okay.
And I think it's not until in the early teens that the brain development goes to the point where you can process abstract thinking.
Yeah.
And that I think would be the marker of the change.
Yeah.
He'd be a lot older than he was.
As I read that section, I thought of adults who pray this way. And I wondered if it's a necessary experience to have earlier in life to traverse that as part of gaining a mature faith. And that if you miss that, then you continue into adulthood with at least a childish element of faith. So it would be similar to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer discusses about community. The best thing God can do for our expectations about the community is to disappoint them. And by disappointing our mental expectations about community, then we have a chance of actually appreciating and participating in the real community that God has gifted to us. It was the thought.
Mhm.
Well, chapter 2, concentration camp. He hates school. He's now choking and sweating, itching too, and thick dark stuff throttled by an Eton collar. Feet already aching with unaccustomed boots.
Poor baby.
Gone are the good old days. Knickerbockers button at the knees that leave a red welt every night pressed into his flesh.
We're glad we didn't get sent away to school.
Not to
during this
mention the
garbage.
bowler hat of iron shoved down on his head.
Pretty graphic.
Well, certainly not having been a boy, nor having gone to a boarding school. The next few chapters are quite the revelation of what that life was like.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think his experience is unique.
No, I wouldn't think so. I certainly don't get the sense that he's embellishing or holding back for that matter.
And you listen to King Charles talk about his experience in school, it sounds a lot like it.
Right.
That it's an anachronism that didn't change.
Well, and he describes the system so well, and the mental framework that says the system must be in place, and then anybody who brings an objection to the system has proven that they need the system
Right.
by objecting. Like, it's just Lewis has that sarcastic dry wit, right? So I mean, I just appreciate that so much. So we have oldie school. Not a great place.
Was drawing those comparisons to English accents and English this and English that,
Yeah,
because he's not English.
right. Oh, and his hate of England when he sees it, right? Like, he's used to these beautiful green blue hills of Ireland, and now he's hit the prairies of England. And it's ugly.
I thought it was interesting that Professor Kirk, in some ways, seems to be modeled on Oldie, not just from the think. When, he's questioning Peter and
What?
Susan about Lucy's story about getting into Narnia.
Yeah,
Well, have you
yeah,
known her to be a liar? And then he would be muttering, what do they teach children
yeah.
in school these days?
So just a small correction. Professor Kirk is actually modeled on a tutor that will meet next week in our reading,
Okay.
not on Oldie.
But he
Oldie,
does say think.
he does, but in a very different way. So Oldie is not a good man, or I think
No.
the tutor that we'll meet is still hard. Like, you don't escape that, and Oldie shares that, but there's no grace in Oldie. It's not for the benefit of the child, it's for the dominance of the child.
Mhm.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, there is an overlap there, and
Yes, I haven't read ahead, so I didn't
no, that's okay.
didn't pick up that there was someone else.
Yeah. And again, we have the arithmetic. You can see why that's always his example of when you go wrong, you got to go back to the place where you got it wrong and start again to keep going with wrong pieces. There's no way to get to the right answer from there.
Well, it's probably a good thing that he was as intelligent as he was, because given that atmosphere, he wouldn't have learned anything
Right. Yeah.
except maybe geometry.
And he kind of says that he really didn't learn anything. So he learned some things there. Just trying to see if there's anything that we want to pull out of this chapter and make particular.
Well, he was kind of introduced to a different family too, the dynamics of
Yes.
Oldie's family, seeing that as a contrast.
Yeah.
So I mean, he's balancing things with what he had and what he sees.
Yeah.
It's kind of a sad affair to him.
So he does note a pattern, points out a pattern to us, the reader. School was coming to reflect a pattern I had already encountered in my home life. At home, the bad times had drawn my brother and me closer together. Here, where the times were always bad, the fear and hatred of Oldie had something of the same effect on us all.
He's seeing his status, starting to see that.
Yeah.
Other kids. Sort of where do you fit in?
Yes. Oldie's wife dies. And there's the bereavement of Oldie, reminiscent of his father. You will remember that I had already learned to fear and hate emotion. Here was a fresh reason to do so. We have a church experience, the Anglo-Catholic. What really mattered was that I heard the doctrines of Christianity taught by men who obviously believed them. I had no skepticism. The effect was to bring life what I would already have said that I believed. In this experience, there was a great deal of fear. If in my books I have spoken too much of hell, and if critics want a historical explanation of the fact, they must seek it not in my supposed Puritanism of my Ulster childhood, but in the Anglo-Catholicism of the church at Belsen. I feared for my soul, especially on certain blazing moonlight nights in that curtainless dormitory, how the sound of other boys breathing in their sleep comes back. The effect, so far as I can judge, was entirely good. I began seriously to pray and to read my Bible and to attempt to obey my conscience. Religion was among the subjects which we often discussed, if my memory serves me, in an entirely healthy and profitable way, with great gravity and without hysteria and without the shamefacedness of older boys. How I went back from this beginning, you shall hear later. There was also a great decline in my imaginative life. For many years, joy was not only absent but forgotten. And then he got into science fiction in which joy didn't mark it. The year was not all term. Life at a vile boarding school is in this way a good preparation for the Christian life. And it
Oh,
teaches one to
geez.
live by hope. Even in a sense by faith. For at the beginning of each term, home and the holidays are so far off that it is hard to realize them as to realize heaven. They have the same pitiful unreality when confronted with immediate horrors. Tomorrow's geometry blots out the distant end of term as tomorrow's operation may blot out the hope of paradise. We have a sense of fear in Lewis that security was taken from him. So in that last chapter at the end, he talked about Atlantis had sunk into the sea. There was no solid ground beneath my feet. It is significant that at this time, if I woke in the night and did not immediately hear my brother's breathing from the neighboring bed, I often suspected that my father and he had secretly risen while I slept and gone off to America, that I was finally abandoned.
Oh, my poor kid.
Such was the effect of my father's rhetoric up to a certain age. Then, quite suddenly, it became ridiculous. And to be fair to his father, he talked about being jovial and a playmate at times. Well, and then we have chapter 3, Mount Bracken and Campbell. How's our time?
Gotta go faster.
Yeah.
We got 40 minutes. We're doing good.
So like, I was trying to picture here, you kept talking about like the beatings, the caning and all this. It sounded pretty brutal.
Bagging.
Yeah, and you got the whole
Oh.
fag system is sexual.
Yeah,
Yeah.
unnatural.
Yeah. Thinking, geez Louise.
I thought it was humorous when he said in the next chapter, after describing all of that, he said, some readers are going to say, you just described some of the most horrific sexual stuff and you just passed over it with a comment.
No big deal.
He says, well, wasn't a temptation for me. It wasn't. So I'm not going to judge somebody else's stuff. And I'm just trying to find, I mean, there's the historical details, but I mean, we want to find things that are significant to us. So friends of our own age, boy and girl friends, we had none. In part, this is a natural result of boarding school. Children grow up strangers to their next door neighbors, but much more it is the result of our own obstinate choice. One boy who lived near us attempted every now and then to get to know us. We avoided him by every means in our power. Our lives were already full, and the holidays too short for all the reading, writing, playing, cycling, and talking that we wanted to get through. We resented the appearance of any third party as an infuriating interruption. we resented even more bitterly all attempts to show us hospitality. So there is a sense of isolation that is in part nature, and it would seem in part nurture. He hated dances.
I can't imagine he knew how.
To me, these dances were a torment.
Mhm.
And ordinary shyness was only a part. It was the false position that tormented me. And I really appreciated this insight, to know that one was regarded as a child and yet be forced to take part in an essentially grown-up function. To feel that all the adults present were being half mockingly kind and pretending to treat you as what you were not.
Mm.
Add to this the discomfort of one's eaten suit and stiff shirt, the aching feet and burning head, and the mere weariness of being kept up so many hours past one's usual bedtime. How a small boy who can neither flirt nor drink should be expected to enjoy prancing about on a polished floor till the small hours of the morning is beyond my conception.
Child abuse.
And then he says, I didn't have any awareness of the social dynamics of this. Didn't realize that certain people, because of civility, were obliged to invite me because my father, they had known my father or my mother. To me, it was inexplicable, unprovoked persecution.
He wants to stay on with his books. I understand.
Yeah, I
Or
love.
be with his brother.
Yeah. When such engagements fell in the last week of the holidays and wrested from us a huge canticle of hours in which every minute was worth gold, I positively felt that I could have torn my hostess limb from limb. Why should she thus pester me? I had never done her any harm, never asked her to a party.
Good answer.
And then there's
Horrors
the
of horrors.
unnatural behavior that he felt he had to adopt as part of it.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, except for boarding school, and even there, in some ways, they raised themselves.
Right. Yeah. Or again, it's the system, right?
Mhm.
Is in place to grind out. And that is a Charles Dickens in what's that? Hard Times.
Great
Grind.
expectations.
No, Hard Times. You're introduced to in the first chapter, grind, speaking to, and Dickens uses words like names like that. It kind of gives you the description of the character, grind. And yes, we have some overlap.
I've never heard of that book. I've
Ooh.
read a lot of Dickens.
Oh, it's a good book, worth it. So it's a lot of Dickens books were written as serials in the newspaper. So that's what
Mhm.
it was. He would write a chapter every week, basically. But, yes. He describes bullying.
Well, things must get better in the next 7 chapters because why he would choose a life in academia based on what I've read so far is totally beyond me. I would run screaming from the room, like, let me out of here.
Right. Well, I think there is a difference, right, between the boarding school, public school, early years and yeah, when you get up. And of course, he's gifted. I mean, he is just he's gifted. So in some ways, what else was he suited to? This guy is a reader, a
Sure.
writer, and a thinker. Like,
Ditch
Yep.
digging is
I-
not his thing.
yeah.
Now, he was a contemporary of Tolkien, right?
They were friends, yeah.
Yeah, because there's one place where he starts talking about becoming enamored of Siegfried and writing poetry
Yeah.
and descend to Earth, descend Celestial 9. The
Yeah.
first thing I thought of was the writers of, the 9 riders
Yes.
from
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings.
Well, and of course, Tolkien not borrows in a direct way, but echoes and is influenced by many of the same things. So they were in a reading, they were colleagues. They would go to the pub and they would write and read each other's stuff in kind of a
Right.
club sort of way. So some of Tolkien's early chapters were read in that context. And Lewis actually has one of his academic works is an experiment in criticism where he talks about how do we evaluate what a good book is? What do we mean when we say that academically, and what would the criteria be? And so he actually talks about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as one of the finest examples of good literature. They did have a falling out, though. Unfortunately.
Anybody surprised?
Well, Lewis was a great borrower and not always with permission.
Well, that'll get you in
So-
trouble.
Even in his space trilogy, he talked about earlier falling in love with science fiction and the heavens and that kind of thing. Well, he takes some of H.G. Wells's stuff and just adapts it for his own use, for his own books. So he'll actually talk about the heavens. He says in the first book, Out of the Silent Planet, as his character Ransom has been taken captive and is in space. He looks out the window and he says, I had been taught that space was this cold, vacuous place. What I saw now is that it was a great river connecting all of the planets in the solar system. And Lewis, in a few words, is able to take something that was cold and frightening and actually make it warm and part of the glory of the heavens. But I'm a fan of Lewis. So, all right. Chapter 4, I broaden my mind. We're now up to 1911. War is approaching, friends.
There's no mention of that at all.
Right. Again,
But he
because
must have been old enough to be aware of what was going on.
well, he's not writing an autobiography. He's writing, and this often gets missed, right? Because it's considered an autobiography, but it's a very highly selected account.
He was
He
quite
moves
clear
from
about that in the preface.
atheism to Christianity.
Mhm.
And then beyond that, of course, he's writing it. So his friends at the time, Alistair McGrath and his biography reports would say they retitled his book Surprised by Jack because that was what his friend called him, was Jack. And it's an edited account. wyvern heals his quarrel with England. And at Charters, I made my first real friends. There too, something far more important happened to me. I ceased to be a Christian. The chronology of this disaster is a little vague, but I know for certain that it had not begun when I went there, and that the process was complete very shortly after I left. I will try to set down what I know of the conscious causes and what I suspect of the unconscious. So there's a matron, Mrs. C, and she's into kind of new age spirituality, spiritualism. So to me, this person reminds me of my mom's mom, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. This spiritualism, Anglo-American occultist tradition. And nothing was further from her intention than to destroy my faith. She could not tell that the room into which she brought this candle was full of gunpowder. She was just living her best life. I had never heard of such things before, except in a nightmare or a fairy tale conceived of spirits other than God and men. Now, for the first time, there burst upon me the idea that there might be real marvels all about us, that the visible world might be only a curtain to conceal huge realms uncharted by my very simple theology. And that started in me something with which, on and off, I've had plenty of trouble since. The desire for the preternatural, simply as such, the passion for the occult. So later on, he says, I didn't struggle with this sexual sin that was happening at my school, so I'm not going to pass judgment on it. But I do talk about the sin I do struggle with. And so occultism is a part of that. I once tried to describe it in a novel. It is a spiritual lust, like the lust of the body. It has the fatal power of making everything else in the world seem uninteresting while it lasts. It's probably this passion, more even than the desire for power, which makes magicians. So think of Uncle Andrew in The Magician's Nephew. Little by little, unconsciously, unintentionally, she loosened the whole framework, blunted all the sharp edges of my belief. The vagueness, the merely speculative character of all this occultism began to spread. Yes, and to spread deliciously to the stern truths of the creed. The whole thing became a matter of speculation. I was soon altering I believe to one does feel, and oh, the relief of it. Those moonlit nights in the dormitory at Belson faded far away. It's something I didn't touch on because I couldn't find it, but should have, that he became stressed out by that attempt to feel his prayers. And if you remember some of his conversation from letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, you can understand why he says some of what he says. So Christianity had become a nightmare for him, the way that he had put the weight on himself to practice it. But those moonlight nights in the dormitory at Belson faded away. From the tyrannous noon of revelation, I passed into the cool evening twilight of higher thought. There was nothing to be obeyed and nothing to be believed except what was either comforting or exciting. Think of the Great Divorce. We had that clergyman that just wanted to keep things broad as long as there's scope for thought, as long as I free mind of inquiry, I'm happy to go to heaven. Well, no, there's none of that mushiness.
pal.
You will see God. You will know the thing that you the thinking is for. And so he admits that he had been desperate to get rid of his religion. He had made his religion intolerable burden. Oh, this is the place where he talks about the burden of prayer, yeah. So, are you sure you were really thinking about what you said? Were you maybe thinking about what you did last night? Then hadn't you better try it over again? I set myself a standard. No clause of my prayer was to be allowed to pass muster unless it was accompanied by what I called a realization. My nightly task was to produce by sheer willpower a phenomenon which willpower could never produce, which was so ill-defined that I could never say with absolute confidence whether it had occurred, and which, even when it did occur, was of very mediocre spiritual value. Think of screw tape letters. You can hear the whispers of screw tape in this section. So he would try to pump up his realizations. And he gave himself insomnia. And then there's the other religions were not even explained in the earlier Christian fashion as the works of devils. That I might conceivably have been brought to believe, but the impression I got was that religion in general, though utterly false, was a natural growth, a kind of endemic nonsense into which humanity tended to blunder. In the midst of 1,000 such religions stood our own, the 1,001st, labeled true. But on what grounds could I believe in this exception? It obviously was in some general sense the same kind of thing as all the rest. Why was it so differently treated? Need I, at any rate, continue to treat it differently? I was very anxious not to. In addition to this, and equally working against my faith, there was in me a deeply ingrained pessimism. A pessimism by that time, much more of intellect than of temper. I was now by no means unhappy, but I had very definitely formed the opinion that the universe was, in the main, a rather regrettable institution. I am inclined to think that the seeds of pessimism were sown before my mother's death. Ridiculous as it may sound, I believe that the clumsiness of my hands, so his thumb, was at the root of the matter.
Your thumb, okay.
Not certainly that a child says, I can't cut a straight line with a pair of scissors, therefore the universe is evil. Childhood has no such power of generalization and is not so silly. Nor did my clumsiness produce what is ordinarily called an inferiority complex. I was not comparing myself with other boys. My defeats occurred in solitude. What they really bred in me was a deep sense of resistance or opposition on the part of inanimate things. Even that makes it too abstract and adult. Perhaps I had better call it a settled expectation that everything would do what you did not want it to do. Whatever you wanted to remain straight would bend. Whatever you tried to bend would fly back to the straight. All knots which you wished to be firm would come untied. All knots you wanted to untie would remain firm. It's not possible to put it into language without making it comic, and I have indeed no wish to see it except as something comic, but it is perhaps just these early experiences which are so fugitive and to an adult so grotesque that give the mind its earliest bias, its habitual sense of what is or is not plausible.
It seems like from talking about his mother's death and everything, he lacks like a feeling of safety. Even
Mhm.
like when he went home from the holidays from school, he's like, I was afraid my dad was gonna up and leave to America.
Mhm.
And it seems like his mother is like the only thing in his mind that relates to like a safe place or a
Yes.
comfortable place. Like, I don't know, kind of like, I forget what that triangle is called, but like at the
Oh, yeah,
base,
yeah, the hierarchy
Yeah.
of needs.
yeah,
Yeah.
hierarchy of needs, like at the base is like a safe
Mhm.
location.
Mhm.
And it seems like he doesn't have that.
Yeah,
And that's kind of his desire. And like this lady was able to kind of manipulate that in like, hey, here's a spirituality where you can feel like you're the higher
right.
self,
Yeah, yeah.
and kind of creating a pigment in his mind of like, hey, this is like a safe place,
Mhm.
is like
Mhm.
yourself, and it's kind of creating yourself into the idol.
Yeah,
And it seems as if he just lacks a place where he feels wanted, needed, and like in a place where he can be himself and safe.
yes. Yes. And he starts to see the world through these lenses, right? My best friend, and he had this formula: term, holidays, till we leave school, and then work, work, work till we die.
Oh, yay.
That's pessimistic,
He got that from his father.
right? Um, it's not strange that I should feel the universe to be a menacing and unfriendly place. So that's exactly what you were saying.
In this chapter too, this is when Pogo comes into the natty dresser,
Yes,
he starts wanting to desire those kinds of things.
yeah,
Plus, I think Mrs. C is a little bit more than just a friend.
okay, maybe. He's had
Well, he
other
says,
such relationships later in life.
She awakened my affections.
yeah, I read something somewhere, I thought.
Yeah. Page 79.
79.
Should have said keep your affection.
79 is the last page in the chapter from me.
Oh,
We have different versions.
yeah, where he said, dear Miss C has been on the occasion of much good to me as well as of evil. For one thing, she awakened my affections. She had done something to defeat that anti-Semitic inhibition, which my early experiences had bred in me.
Hmm.
Nor would I deny her in all her highest thoughts.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then on the next page, he goes on to say, it's quite true. At this time, I underwent a violent and wholly successful assault of sexual temptation.
Right.
But this is simply accounted for by the age I had then reached, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah.
And Annie says quite rightly, withdrawal of myself from divine protection.
Right. Yeah.
So he was beguiled by Pogo to, want the things of the world, as it were.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So he was just getting attacked from every which way.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, in some ways, this is just the way the world works out, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot of even Christian kind of influence for him. And so away from that, alone, and then there's this woman that he has some affection for, and she opens up a whole new world, and then this friend, and so things start to get a little bit raunchier. So we have the loss of faith, the virtue of simplicity. And then there's something else going on.
Vulgarity.
Okay, well, we're running out of time. So we got three more chapters, 5, 6, and 7. So we have, as he comes into contact with Norse mythology, we suddenly have this recovery. With that plunge back into my own past, there arose at once, almost like heartbreak, the memory of joy itself, the knowledge that I had once had, what I had now lacked for years, that I was returning at last from exile and desert lands to my own country. And the distance of the twilight of the gods and the distance of my own past joy, both unattainable, flowed together into a unendurable sense of desire and loss, which suddenly became with the loss of the whole experience, which, as I now stared around that dusty schoolroom like a man recovering from an unconsciousness, had already vanished, had eluded me at the very moment when I could first say it is. And at once I knew that to have it again was the supreme and only important object of desire. So here's the opera, and here's mood. So once again, we have beauty, we have joy. I think something that's important to note here is this comes at the moment of the loss of faith, right? So we recognize that while there's something happening in him and to him, God is still at work and moving. I think that's significant. It's no coincidence that he hears this. Lewis, in another place, will say the atheist cannot be too careful in the world because God is always laying traps for him.
Yeah.
In this chapter, he was introduced to music. His dad gave him a gramophone, and now
Yep.
he's into tunes.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, Isaiah?
We got a little more about boxing, Animal Land, Lord of Big. Then we have the chapter 6 is Bloodery. So that's the description of the fagging system of school. Pretty awful. And to me, at the end of that chapter, I don't think there's much that we need to point out there, but to me, it was the end of the chapter that spoke. At the tail end of this, I must repeat that I was tired. Consciousness itself was becoming the supreme evil. Sleep, the prime good. To lie down, to be out of the sound of voices, to pretend and grimace and evade and slink no more. That was the object of all desire. If only there were not another morning ahead, if only sleep could last forever. I think, in addition to trauma, I think he was severely depressed and not quite suicidal, but ready for death.
And how old was he?
I don't know. But he's
I was
still a
just
young
gonna-
guy, like he's still a child.
50.
Yeah.
Um.
Well,
I
he's like
maybe even
13 or
younger than that.
14, probably,
Yeah.
I think.
No, that was
That'd be
before.
13 at the
A couple
beginning.
chapters ahead.
It was probably 15 or 16.
Um. Anyhow. It
You
ain't good,
certainly see why their young men in those situations killed themselves.
right?
Yeah, they're just-
Because there was no hope, like no one would believe them, like at home. Even if
You
they
dare
tried to
say
say
what
what
was
was
happening
going on
to
and
the school,
happening to
yeah.
them, no one would believe them.
Yeah.
Or if they did, they didn't want to hear it.
Well, and to complain was to demonstrate that you needed the system, right? So
Right.
Sorry.
pay
Mhm.
him harder, get him
Yeah.
into line.
Some of
Yeah,
it,
when I was reading, it reminded me a lot of the movie Dead Poets Society,
Right, yeah,
and that the one boy ends up killing himself.
yes. Although that was over his father,
Father, yes,
was the
and
school
different
system, but
reasons. but-
yeah. Yeah, I can understand the relationship.
he kind of brought in a good summary on chapter 7 as soon as he went into it. He was coming on it.
Yeah,
Whole chapter describing his old school, the furnace of impure loves without.
yeah. Of course, what he wants to confess is that it made him a prig,
Mhm.
pompous.
Getting beat up just by the way he looked at people.
Right,
He had resting bee face before that was the same. I think he always looked grumpy or cranky.
Or smart aleck. Looked like he was smart.
well, and
Probably what that
I
you-
appreciated when he said, you know, children get a raw deal. They try and hold their face innocent, and they get told that they're gonna get the smirk smacked off of it.
Yep.
And when they're trying to look tough or, you know, smirky, they get told they look stupid. So I understood that. I also noticed with some of the names that he does, and obviously he still has resentment because he actually knows their names, but he doesn't use them until later, and it almost seems accidental. But I noticed that when he does give them names, they're very close to the demon names used in Screw Tape.
Hmm.
Yeah, glove and blub and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Exactly. Could have been Glubos. There were two blessings at Wyvern that wore no disguise. One was smudgy.
Hmm. Thank goodness there was something.
Hmm.
Yeah, I didn't read didn't quite finish. The last 4 pages I didn't read.
Well, that's okay. The other undisguised blessing was the Gurney, the school library.
Mhm.
Not because it was a library, but because it was a sanctuary.
If you could get there.
Yeah. If you could run the gauntlet.
Okay.
I thought it was interesting, I haven't studied Norse mythology. But the Marvel movies, we have some of that. And so it's kind of funny that he gravitated to Loki. And he understood Loki against Odin. And then Thor is the real villain.
I know what backwards land there.
Yeah.
I gotta watch those movies again. 'Cause
Well, I think maybe you got to read the
read the real book and never
exactly.
mind the movies.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I really always really liked Loki though. Submit movies.
Yeah, I've only a little bit on the fringes, like the Ride of the Valkyrie, I recognize. Like that kind of music. Like when I was in my 20s, I used to listen to Wagner and stuff. Like
I
I'd go
think
to the
you mean
library and bring those
Wagner.
records home.
Yes.
The other feature in Loki Bound, which may be worth commenting on, is the pessimism. I was at this time living like so many atheists or anti-theists in a whirl of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world.
And also responsible for making his life hell on earth, basically.
It remains true that I have almost all my life been quite unable to feel that horror of non-entity of annihilation. I felt it for the very first time only in 1947, but that was after I had long been reconverted and thus begun to know what life really is and what would have been lost by missing it. Okay. Oh, perfect. 8:30.